Gracious God, let these words be more than words. Give us the Spirit of Jesus. Amen. Please be seated. Let me begin with a word of welcome. If it has been a while since you've been in church, welcome. If you've never been to church before, welcome. If you are here because the world outside doesn't seem to make much sense, welcome. It is good that you are here today. I've been thinking a lot this week, as you might imagine, about what the church can possibly offer, about what a Christian leader could possibly say today to people who are weary-hearted, to people who are scared, to people who are angry. What can a leader say to people who aren't in a place of despair, but who are maybe nervous about how divided our nation has become? What does our tradition have to offer? For a lens on that, I want to spend some time this morning with Howard Thurman. One of Dr. King's mentors, the Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman, was called by some the mystic of the civil rights movement. And if you want a short text to help you meditate on what's going on in the psyche and soul of our nation today, he wrote a book in the 1950s called Jesus and the Disinherited. And it is as good today as it was when he first wrote it. It will teach you about what is going on in our country. In it, Howard Thurman writes that Christianity appears as a technique for survival for the oppressed. Christianity appears as a technique for the survival of the oppressed. Think about that for a moment. How many times in Christian history has it been taught that Christianity is a technique for survival, particularly for the oppressed? It has been said that the Bible itself is rather unique among the ancient documents of the world because it isn't the record, it's not the record of a conquering people. Most of the ancient manuscripts that we have are records of empires. They tell the story from the view of the Romans or from the Egyptians, from the side of history's winners. What makes the Bible so fascinating is how often it tells the story of a people on the underside of history, the people Dr. Thurman called the disinherited. The Bible is the spiritual heritage of survivors, of folks living on the margin, of people who faced enslavement and persecution. The biblical story is a story of spiritual liberation, often in the face of political oppression. And today, on a day when some of us really need them, we have two stories of survivors. The first comes to us from the book of Ruth. Naomi and Ruth are an unlikely pair. And Naomi and her husband and her two sons, they were refugees from Judah to Moab. Because of a famine, they fled the land of their ancestors, and within 10 years, all of the men have died. Naomi is left with two daughters-in-law, one of whom, for reasons we can understand, heads back to her family's hearth, goes back to her family of origin. But Ruth refuses to leave. Ruth's decision to join Naomi's people, to move with her to Bethlehem, is dangerous. Ruth would have faced deep discrimination in Judah. Moabites were not well regarded by their Judean neighbors. They were thought to be the descendants of sexual impurity, sexual sin, and they were derided. They were the people who were blamed for everything in Judah. And yet, Ruth says to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." As an aside, I always find it interesting that On a lot of Christian websites and stores, you can buy wedding gear with these words on it. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. When an opposite gender couple is getting married and they want that reading, I make them read the whole book. This is the words of a daughter-in-law, an unexpected daughter-in-law, an outsider daughter-in-law to her mother-in-law. These are words of love spoken between two women. So a wedding of two women, sure. But otherwise, But don't miss what's radical. Ruth's decision not to leave Naomi, her willingness to face down discrimination for the sake of love, for the sake of community, it's a measure of wild and perhaps foolish grace. And we need to tell stories like those of Ruth. We need the stories of immigrants who faced down their neighbor's hatred, who chose love and dignity and welcome. We need stories of those who chose not the safe route, but the road that led to deeper integration, to fellowship, and to freedom. We're living through days when the hateful language around race and gender and ethnicity were again at the center of a winning presidential campaign. More than half the voters in this country either bought into or chose to ignore the bigotry unleashed by President Trump as they checked the box next to his name. And there have been calls in the days since the election to come together. And I've got to be honest with you, today I can only muster one small part of a call to come together. The only call to come together I can manage today is this. We have to come together against hatred. We have to come together against transphobia. We have to come together to defend our immigrant neighbors. We have to come together to stand up for all who were belittled by the president-elect's campaign. In the days ahead, I want to understand what motivated so many of my fellow citizens to vote the way they did. I have to hope that the majority of this country voted with a bitter taste in their mouth, believing it was the right economic choice for their families. I have to believe that many of the voters who selected this president will want to come together against hate. But I also know that for many of us in this congregation, this week felt heavy, so heavy, because we've seen what unleashed hatred can do when it is allied with power. So let me say today clearly to my trans siblings, to my LGBTQ plus siblings, to my Latino Hispanic siblings, to my immigrant siblings, whatever your status, to women who have seen this abuse and hatred before, who are terrified about the policies to come, let me say in the words of Ruth, where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. This church will stand with you as you face what comes next. This is a place we will gather to pray. We will be a place of safety and comfort, and we will be a place to take action against hate. We won't stay silent. We will organize and act and defend the rights of our neighbors. That's who we are, and no election can change who we are. At the end of Ruth, back in the Bible, as it often does, the Bible gives us a twist. The last verse of Ruth is a genealogy, and I'll forgive you if you glazed over. There are a lot of genealogies in the Bible. A lot of them are pages long, and they're boring, right? But there are genealogies which are radical texts, and this is one of them. The last verse of the book of Ruth tells us that a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He became father of Jesse, the father of David. David, the quintessential king of Israel, the anointed of God, has Ruth, the Moabite, the outsider, the immigrant, the one who shouldn't count. David has Ruth as his ancestor. And it doesn't stop here. The Gospel of Matthew, the first book in the New Testament, makes this link again in its first chapter, another genealogy. But Ruth's name appears among the ancestors of Jesus. This should surprise us. This is not what we would expect. I think Ruth is listed among the ancestors of Jesus and David as a reminder that our faith teaches us how to survive oppression, how to survive in times of desperation, how to survive. Ours is a faith that teaches reckless love. Ours is a faith that always teaches us to stand up to injustice, to choose our neighbors, to choose community over fear. That is the power of the story of Ruth. Choosing love over fear, it may not be a strategy for winning in the short game of politics, but it is the only way to survive in the long term with your soul intact, choosing our neighbors and choosing love over fear. The other story we have this morning comes from Jesus. Jesus today also focuses in on widows. And at first, he tells his followers, beware. Beware of the leaders who are out there demanding your praise. And lest the clergy get ahead of ourselves, Jesus also says, beware those who put on long robes and say long prayers. Beware, for they devour widows' houses. Remember, Jesus lived in a time of oppression, under the thumb of the Roman Empire. Howard Thurman wrote famously that Jesus has a great deal to teach the people who have their back up against the wall. Today, that teaching comes as Jesus asks his disciples, do you see that woman, the widow? We would understand if they missed her. She's one of the invisible ones in society. Jesus says, look, she has offered her all. Jesus tells his followers not to identify with the lawyers, sorry, David, not with the wealthy who seemingly give great gifts from what they have left over. Jesus says, notice the hungry. Follow the example of the widow. Identify with those who don't have enough and yet still give of what little they have. Jesus lifts up this poor widow as an example. If you want to survive, if you want to survive with your integrity and your spirit intact, don't put yourself first. I had a friend in seminary who went to plant a new church in California. And as new church plants do, they went about reinventing some of the old language we use in church. And honestly, some of it was really cheesy. But one line caught my imagination, and I've come back to it this week. You see, many of the folks from California that were forming this church, they struggled with the label Christian, because Christianity had so often been associated with abuses of power. And in response, they didn't disown the word Christian, but they added some language. They clarified who they wanted to be as Christians. They said they wanted to be love-spreading difference makers. That description came back to me this week. How different would our politics be if Christians aspired always to be love-spreading difference makers? I have to say, this week, St. Michael's, it was you I had on my mind as I thought about making a love-spreading difference. You gave me hope for our faith. You gave me hope for our country. The day after the election, 60 of us gathered here in the church for Eucharist. And some of us were teary. Some of us needed hugs. But we showed up. We showed up for one another. And we prayed. Earlier that morning, another group showed up in a parking lot not far from here, a group of parishioners that every month takes a group of supplies down to the shelters in El Paso for folks who are crossing the border. If you look at the back of your insert, you can see the list of all of the donations that they took down there for our immigrant neighbors. On Tuesday, Election Day, we registered about a dozen asylum seekers to receive food from our food pantry. We fed over 100 families. This weekend, our diocese debated and passed changes to undo a legacy of discrimination and make our church more welcoming to LGBTQ+ people. This week, the church made me proud. And in the days and years ahead, I have confidence we will continue to stand up. I won't pretend that this work will be easy. Showing up may be hard for a while. It may have taken a lot for you to make it in those doors this day, but I'd encourage you to continue to show up. Seek community. Building relationships is one of the best ways I know to build your capacity to hope. Claiming your voice, standing up to power, working for justice, caring for the widows and the poor, these are not light work. Not work that we should do alone. Soul work is hardly ever light work. It's not work you can do alone. But it is how we rebuild hope. My friends, we follow a tradition of survivors, of women like Ruth and Naomi, of people like the generous widow. We follow Jesus, a poor Jew, powerless in the eyes of the world, who in the face of the Roman oppression taught a way of self-offering love. Ours is a faith which asks us to look always to the edges, to the borders, to pay attention to those our society would disinherit, and to stand with them, because God is always, always with the outsiders. We will face the days to come with wild and foolish grace. We will pray, as we'll sing in the last hymn today, that God will grant us wisdom, that God will grant us courage. If today you need a minute to grieve, that's okay. Take time. But also know, as Howard Thurman told us, ours is a faith which teaches us to survive. We will survive, and we will become the love-spreading difference makers our world again so desperately needs, because our spirits cannot afford anything less. Amen.